to the Shah Lusso live show. Pretty much I just had a very busy week, so I didn't have time to put a video together, but I didn't want to leave you all hanging. So I thought I would just do a quick live and yeah, just see sort of who ends up being in the chat box, answer a couple questions. I want to start out though, talking about this whole Panerai in-house thing that's been going on. For those of you who don't know, a few weeks back, Panerai released a new watch. Said it had this in-house movement, the P9002, if I'm not mistaken. And lo and behold, despite everyone, saying, that okay, it's an in-house movement, all the publications, no one bothered really to check, and it turned out that it was an ETA with Dubois de Perras module on it, so nothing in-house at all about it. But yeah, like it calls a lot into question. Obviously, Panerai has had a few controversies in the past, like with the Brooklyn Bridge, where they had this, really nice case back and then a terribly finished movement on the inside. Panerai hasn't had the best, shall we say, the best reputation when it comes to when it comes to their movements. So I think this wasn't really a great move for Panerai and largely unnecessary. At the end of the day, no one has that many expectations. Not every brand has the expectation that every watch is going to be in-house. But they used to have no problem declaring that. Originally how it used to be was you would have the OP line, so caliber OP, and then a Roman numeral. That would signify an externally sourced movement, whereas their in-house ones will be, the P dot and then regular numbers. But for whatever reason, they decided to market this as in-house. Now, there's been plenty of controversy and people sort of investigating, asking the brand. Obviously, I think someone even asked them on Instagram, and they replied, yes, this is our in-house movement. But it does call into question a lot of what that definition of in-house is. There was a really, really good article from Blog to Watch where they go into elaborate that a lot of Panerai's in-house movements aren't really technically made by Panerai either. They're made by Valfleurier, and that is the Richemont Group's sort of in-house movement arm. Now, my opinion is that if it's made in group, you can still kind of call it in-house. I look at it the same way as Swatch Group and ETA. If it's in group and if it's not something that's sold outside of the group, then I think those, you can still kind of call it in-house. So, for example, in something like Swatch Group, if you have a Longines with a standard ETA 2824, then yeah, you can't call that in-house, even though ETA makes it. Swatch is owned by, ETA is owned by Longines, and ETA is owned by Swatch Group, and so is Longines. However, the difference is that there are also certain modifications of that, certain versions of that only Longines gets. The same thing with some of their chronographs. The same thing with the Omega 8800, 8500s. Those are all made exclusively for Omega by ETA. So while they are in group, they're not technically in-house either, but in my view they are. So what I think Panerai easily could have done to avoid this whole thing is they could have just named it OP and then thrown some Roman numerals after it and simply marketed it as it is. I mean, everyone's highlighting the rose gold version, which costs like 27,000 US, but we know the majority of that price is the markup for being a precious metal variant. They could have easily marketed that as OP caliber XYZ and just not put much emphasis on the caliber like they used to. A great example of times when they've used externally sourced calibers where it's worked really well for them is things like a lot of their early Luminar chronographs were Zenithal Primeros. They had no trouble. They would just assign an OP number to that. They had the open case back. You could clearly see it was an El Primero, but it was good. On the contrary, it actually added, in my view, some validity to it. Whereas with what they're doing now, it's just like, it's just a bit shady. However, with the things like the OPs, for example, with those, I'm perfectly fine with those being, with the P dot and then a certain number after it. With those, I'm fine with those being labeled as in-house because they're in group. At the end of the day, for the most part, they're not shared. There are some that are shared, for example, with Cartier. Cartier also shares, for example, its 1847. Is it the 1847? No, it's the 1904. The 1904 caliber. It shares that with Vacheron Constantin, for the 56. So in that case, and I've spoken on this in other videos, I think it's perfectly fine. If anything, it benefits that sharing within group, because they can share technologies. It's easier to repair. It means that some groups can sort of push themselves upward. Some brands can push themselves upwards. Other ones can have maybe a more entry-level approach. So I think in that sense, it's a very healthy way for companies to share caliber amongst themselves without necessarily resorting to the regular sort of standard ETA Salitas that everyone uses. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think that this whole Panerai thing is overblown? Does it matter to you? I mean, what are your expectations from Panerai to begin with? I think for a lot of people, you don't necessarily buy a Panerai for the movement on the inside, though a lot of their quoted as in-house movements are, they have strong power reserves, and in my view at least, they're decent to look at as well. But yeah, it's a bit weird that they would bother doing this, just because in my view at least, the expectation for most Panerais isn't to do with the movements, to do with the look, it's to do with the feel. And lately at least, it's also to do with the materials. Panerai's been doing so much work with experimenting with different materials, with the carbotanium, with the Carbotech, with titanium in the past, with steel obviously, with ceramics. They've done so many cool things with materials. I don't know why they would shoot themselves in the foot by creating noise over a movement that isn't theirs and that isn't much to write home about. So just give me 1 second, guys, while I just see if I can try and pull up the chat, because I can't actually see it. Let's see. If anyone knows how I can see the chat on an iPad, please help. Because, I don't do these live streams that often. I think the last one I did was at the very beginning of the year. So I don't get too much opportunity to practice them, especially when I'm just doing them direct. But if you guys will give me 1 sec, then hopefully I can pull up the live chat and start answering some of your questions as well. So, alright, cool. So now I've got that up. Cool. So while we wait for a few more people to come in, so that's my thoughts on the whole Panerai thing. I think they should just put more emphasis, on making cool looking models, and then just not being ashamed of what they put on the inside. I guess the reason why most people take a bit of issue with it is probably because it whiffs a little bit of cost cutting. The notion that, all right, they have this watch that, of course, everyone uses the $27,000 one as an example, but again, it's rose gold. But I think even the steel one is like 10,000 retail or something like that. They have this watch that looks cool, looks distinctive. Granted, it's expensive. It whiffs of cost cutting if you're selling a watch that's, close to 10,000. Honestly, it might be more than 5,000. You should either have heavily modified ETA, an in-group movement, or an in-house movement, or some solid reason as to why you're putting an ETA or a Salida in there that isn't cost cutting. Because at the end of the day, it's just a value proposition. And when you look on the pre-owned market, there's so many options. If you want something, like you can get an ETA 2892 with a modular on top for as low as 1,500, 2,000 US. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense in my view to just go down that route. I think they could have easily done themselves a big favor and just called an OP caliber. Some people would probably buy it still. A lot of people probably wouldn't care. But it's got a lot of the wrong attention in my view for not a lot of benefit. Now, moving on, I also wanted to talk a little bit about just how the year has gone. I mean, we're in August already, which is a bit crazy. We've passed the main releases season, as well as we've seen a lot of independent releases. But starting out from the beginning, I think for me, the big highlights for the year have definitely been from Breitling. I mean, they came out first off with the new Premier collection a day before all the releases from Watches and Wonders, which I think was a masterstroke in terms of the timing. At first, I didn't understand it. I thought, why are they going to let their thunder be stolen by everyone else? But I think by doing it just the day before, they managed to reach a lot of people, capitalize on a lot of that buzz. And yeah, the watches they put out were amazing. I, for a long time, had been talking about how it'd be great to have the B09 with an open case back and have it in more watches, because at the end of the day, it's a 70-hour power reserve. with 3 days of power reserve, you don't necessarily need automatic winding, because if, like me, you change your watches every few days. I very rarely have to make use of the power reserve of my watches because I change them every 2 or 3 days anyway. At which point I remember that I didn't do a wrist check at the beginning, so today I'm wearing my Omega Seamaster 300M on a 7 Friends and Watches leather strap, or well, it's like nubuck, I think it's called. And then on the inside, it's actually got this cool little textile. I'll do a review of it probably next week. But really, really comfortable strap, and especially because it's mad hot here. So definitely recommend looking into those. But yeah, if you change your watches every, if you have a power reserve of 70 hours, if you change your watches every 2 days, for example, you're never going to run into that limit of the power reserve. So for that, you don't need automatic winding. So I'm really, really glad that Breitling embraced that. They put the B09 in the 40mm Premier with the pistachio dial, which I think was a really cool take on the market's current obsession with green dials. But what I really thought was a highlight was, in fact, the split second. Everyone talked about the Datora, which admittedly looks great, but that's also a conceptual movement based on a 7750. Nothing really to write home about mechanically. But the split second is so cool because, for one thing, it's a split second chronograph. That on its own, there's not too many. Secondly, it's in a good looking Premier case with a blue dial. It's got a nice, easily accessible sizing. Because it's that manual wind, it's also a little bit thinner than a lot of other modern chronographs. But also the fact that it is a manual wind split second chronograph. I mean, who else is making those? And especially at this price point. If you think, probably the only other competition doing manual wind split second chronograph, apart from a few, random sort of maybe more artisanal and modified things, for example, Habring comes to mind as a company that probably would offer better value in terms of a split second for less than $10,000. But apart from that, their competition is coming from the likes of, Pateks and Langes and things like that. And obviously, I don't think people are going to cross-shop them, but it is a pretty good shot across the bow in terms of the value proposition that Breitling has got an in-house 70-hour power reserve manual wind split-second chrono for around 10,000 US in a good-looking case as well. So I think that was a massive stroke to start out the year. Then they continued on a few months after, once all the sort of hype had died down from Watches and Wonders, and they came out with the Super Chronomat. And that, again, I think was a great move. I think Breitling has done a very interesting sort of U-turn in that they went away from the big watches and then now they've kind of circled back to them. But in a more modern execution, the lug-to-lug sizing is still much better than what it was on, for example, the previous Chronomat. They're not enormous and super, super shiny. It's a much more modern take, and I think that in many ways Breitling was kind of stuck in the early parts of the 2000s with a lot of their collection. So I think that evolution on the Chronomat looked really, really cool. Probably too big for me, but I still think it's a really, really cool execution. And again, for me, the highlight is that they brought out a new complication or resurrected an old one, which was the 4-year calendar, which admittedly, it's a little cheat code. It's a way around not really doing a full-on annual or perpetual, but they still managed to do it in a way that is historically accurate. I mean, Breitling pioneered that sort of effort with things like the Transocean 1461 that they had. It's sort of a Breitling complication. I think maybe others have used it, and they use a module to do it anyway, a module on top of a, I think it's on top of a 2824 if I'm not mistaken. In any case, it's a modular chronograph. It's not, anything in-house. I wish they would have done it on top of the B09, but for whatever reason they didn't. But it's interesting. It's interesting, it's different, and something close to a perpetual calendar on a big sports watch like that with proper water resistance and a chronograph. Again, you don't really find it. The closest thing would be maybe the Hublot Big Bang Perpetual, which is a proper perpetual calendar. However, that obviously is like 4 times the price, and not everyone's cup of tea necessarily. I actually quite like it though. And also that one has terrible water resistance, I think, because of the they fit the pushers into that sort of center gasket. That's where they put the pushers for the perpetual calendar. So yeah, I think that limited the water resistance. But still a really, really cool watch, and definitely something that I'd love to have in hand, if not in my collection at some point. It's something that you don't need. It's completely stupid, but it's still cool, But so I think Breitling with that, again, they knocked it out of the park. They got a lot of good press and a nice solid evolution on what, in my view, was one of my favorite releases from them, which was the Chronomat that they released last year during COVID in their first webcast, the Chronomat 42 with a B01. I think that is an amazing watch, and it's a watch that I've had my mind on for a long time, if I'm honest. Like, I really, really like the Chronomat B01. It's just a case of it's a bit out of my budget for what I can spend right now, but it looks so good. I don't know. I'm in half a mind to think, okay, I should combine, because right now I want a chronograph and I want a GMT. I have a couple watches on my mind that I could kind of make that happen with getting both of them before the end of the year, or I could combine budgets and just go ahead and get the Premier B01. The Chronomat B01. So, yeah, it's a tough call. I have to see at the end of the day. I have a few announcements that will come later in the year. They'll probably reveal why I'm waiting before I buy. But yeah, long story short, I still have a few months to sort of wait around and figure out what I do. But definitely the B01 Chronomat is definitely one that's on my radar just because it looks amazing. You know, I love the 80s styling, the rouleau bracelet. Value-wise, I think it is very good value when you consider what you get. And especially now with that new rubber rouleau bracelet, I think that looks really, really cool. I was really surprised when they did they did a his and hers edition of the Chronomat. It was a Chronomat 42 B01 and a women's Chronomat, both with baby blue dials, both with rubber straps. Weirdly, they used the older rubber strap, though, the one that was originally released on the rose gold. And my guess for that is that they're phasing those out, so they just decide, okay, create a limited edition, just get more of those rubber straps out, so then they can just continue with production on the Rouleau-inspired rubber strap that they introduced on the Super Chronomat. But yeah, that rubber strap, the Rouleau-inspired one on the regular Chronomat 42, I think that would look sick as well. What do you guys think? Have you guys seen any Chronomats on straps? I've seen one listed, and I think it looked really, really cool. It was on Chrono 24. It might still actually be there. They've shown it on like a sort of tan color crocodile strap, as well as a blue rubber strap, a white rubber strap. It looks great on all of them. I mean, don't get me wrong, the bracelet, I love it, but I love some good versatility on a watch as well. So I think those really, like, Breitling's been doing an amazing job in terms of their releases. Other watches that were released, one that's very curious for me is the Omega Seamaster 300. That was released, I think, was outside of the regular release schedule, but the changes that they made to it, I'm not sure if I understand them. I mean, they added patina to, like, I understand that they changed the bezel to be aluminum. You know, it's a little bit more retro. Makes sense. A little bit of, shall we say, Black Bay inspiration. But then they also decided to patina the numerals on the bezel, which, to my knowledge, that doesn't really actually happen. Like, numerals on bezels don't really patina like they do in dials because they're not luminova. So I thought that was a bit weird, and then also they put the lollipop seconds, which is very similar to the 2014 or 15 Spectre Edition Seamaster 300. So that, I feel, just took a little bit away from the specialness of that, and Omega does tend to do that sometimes. They do kind of shoot themselves in the foot, or perhaps shoot the foot of the people who buy their special editions by then coming up with a regular edition that's very similar. But what I do love that they did with the Seamaster 300 was the sandwich style dial. That, I think, looks really cool. Adds a lot of depth to the dial, and I think just that notion of having a few more layers to the dial makes all the difference. It makes it a little bit more special, and the loom shot on it also looks pretty crazy as well. And of course, sandwich dials, as we know, are closely sort of related with Panerai, which is what sort of started this live. And that's, again, something where I feel Panerai should definitely explore more, you know, play around with the notion of their sandwich dials instead of getting themselves caught up in, you know, these problems with whether their movement is in-house or not. I think that's a better way for them to get a little bit more, shall we say, credibility by focusing on their strengths instead of misleading about their weaknesses, perhaps. But yeah, it's an interesting one. But yeah, apart from those two other good releases, I mean, Rolex, of course, we know was pretty much a bust for this year. It depends. I know there's some people who really like the Rolex approach of, slow, steady evolution. And yeah, for some, I guess if you love the design, then that's great because it means you can just change in your watch and just have a better movement whenever the new ones come out. And obviously, all these new ones came out with new movements, and that was an upgrade for them. And, in that sense, you can't really fault Rolex. But I was pretty disappointed just at the missed opportunity with the Explorer 2 to either try out a different material bezel, or perhaps even at least just color the hand green to mark the anniversary, something. But I am hearing rumors though that Rolex might not be done with 2021 yet. They recently released a few new precious metal variants with like diamonds. I think it was a Tiger's Eye Daytona. I saw it on the Paul Tote channel. It was a Tiger's Eye Daytona in red gold and white gold, and then a few diamond set ones. So, I mean, who knows? They might still come out with something this year to sort of commemorate that anniversary. But my guess is they're just going to keep going. I mean, there are probably, from people I know, there's already wait lists on them. Not super long because it is still an Explorer 2. But, there's still wait lists on them. Still, there's already people trying to sell them for above retail. And similar sort of thing with the 36mm Explorer. That one, however, I think makes some more sense because that full-size, no-date segment is getting a bit crowded, in my view, for Rolex when you consider they have now the OPs, and the Air King is still there playing it. The Air King, I think, is 40 millimeters. The Milgauss as well. Like, until they replace those, I think they're going to they want to fill out that little gap between 36 and 41. So it makes sense that, they unclutter that a little bit, and clearly the Explorer is one of those ones where they're going to do that. And I think it makes sense because there's also a lot of traditionalists who like Explorer, and they like, its simplicity. For me, again, it's not a watch that particularly appeals, but I understand it to a degree. So I think that it'll be interesting to see how the market responds to that long term, but I don't think that's going to hurt Rolex. The two-tone Explorer in 36, yeah, I think it actually looks cool. I know that it completely contradicts the purpose of it, but let's face it, when they came out with a two-tone Sea Dweller, that kind of confirmed that, okay, Rolex has really closed that cycle that they started when they were considering replacing the Submariner with the Yachtmaster back in the early 90s. They've really sort of come full circle and full realization that, yes, we are an all-out-and-out luxury goods company. We don't make tool watches anymore. No one's stabbing with these. Even though some people still will and still can, which is crucial. Like, I think that's important, that they don't sacrifice the luxury, they don't sacrifice the function for the luxury, but they recognize very well that, you can go with a two-tone Explorer, it will probably get the same use that a steel one will, which is being worn on the wrist, appreciated, enjoyed, but probably, it's a luxury item at the end of the day. So, yeah, depending on how you cut it, if you like Rolex's evolutionary approach, then, this was a great year, like every year. If you're like me, that would have liked to see something a little bit different, but was not that surprised to see that there wasn't, then it was a bit of a disappointment. But I think for me, what will be most surprising is to see if they do release anything else this year. Tudor, on the other hand, has had a field day with, just materials. I mean, this year we got the silver Black Bay. We got the full bronze one now. We got the ceramic one. We got, I feel like I'm missing something. The gold one, of course. So they're playing around a lot more with materials than they did before. And I think that's great. I think Tudor has always been the opportunity for Rolex to do something that they won't do with the Rolex brand. They use Tudor for it. So of those, though, my favorite is definitely the ceramic. I think the concept of it is great. It's an amazing value proposition, which I think is what Tudor really excels at. I love that it sort of takes up the METAS certification. I mean, I did a video on it. I don't think Omega really actually needs to be worried about it, but it is interesting seeing them sort of going at each other in terms of, I guess, fighting back and forth. But in a way, it's kind of like Rolex saying "fuck you" because they didn't fight back with Rolex. They fought back with Tudor instead. But at the same time, I don't think Omega's going to lose any sleep. This was never an in-house standard. They just happened to be the first, and it took 5 or 6 years for any other brand to be able to catch up to them to use that certification. So in that sense, I think it speaks to Omega's merit of how good they must have been being able to do this 5 years ago, doing it in nearly all of their watches. It took that long for another company to sort of be able to catch up for them. And that it was the Rolex group of all things, it's a good company to be in. So I don't think Omega's going to be worried, but I just love that ceramic Tudor. I think it's really, really cool. I like that they actually did special decoration on the rotor and on the base plates. It has that sort of texture to it. They went the extra mile, and I think that means that there's going to be more open case back Tudor watches coming soon, and that they're going to step up their game in terms of the decoration, which I think is great, because again, it's something that Rolex won't do, so they'll do it with Tudor, and the end result, I think, is that it still looks really, really cool. So yeah, my favorite was definitely the ceramic one, though I do actually really like the bronze one as well. I can't lie. I think it looks really cool. I honestly wish they just went all out and made actual rose gold. But I guess they are still testing the waters with that yellow gold one to see if people are willing to pay proper precious metal pricing for a Tudor. But I think the bronze one looks really, really cool. There's a really good hands-on video from Rita from Watch Society. Make sure you check that out as well, where he gets hands-on with the bronze Tudor, and yeah, it looks really sick. The colors are amazing, and I'd be interested to see how it ages over time. And then, yeah, what other brands no other brands have really stood out too much this year. I mean, obviously there was the AP Black Panther, which caused a little bit of a stir. Most people, from what I know, don't really like it. I think it's a cool concept, even if it's not for me. And I've done a few renderings of other potential Marvel crossovers that they could have done. I'd really like to see them use the 1159 as a platform for that, because if you haven't seen it already, they have a really interesting use of two-tone with the 1159, where they'll do the case band will be done. In one case, they had it done with ceramic on the inner case band, and then the outer parts of the case are rose gold. It looks amazing. It's a very different take on two-tone to what we're normally used to, and it also highlights, I think, the really cool things about the 1159, which is, of course, the fact that it has those evacuated lugs. It has that octagon on the inside as the case band, paying homage, of course, to the Royal Oak, but without playing too heavy on it. The 1159, in my view, is extremely underrated. I think that, yeah, the original three-hander releases looked a bit boring, a bit sterile, but if you look at some of the new ones, like with the gradient dials, with the use of two-tone and different materials, of course, the Aventurine Perpetual Calendar looks amazing, but they're really, really making a good effort, I think, with the 1159. I honestly want to see what it looks like on a bracelet. I'd love to see AP create an all-new bracelet to integrate nicely with those really cool evacuated lugs that the 1159 has, and that, I think, would take it to another level. That, obviously, do it in steel. I think then they could have not a Royal Oak replacement, but something that could, create sort of a third pillar in terms of the Royal Oak offshore, and then the 1159 in the steel variant, so that they can have, just something other than a Royal Oak as part of their main collection. Because really, they don't do too much else. I say we've got my buddy Alexander in the building and in the chat. How you doing, man? Very, very good friend of the channel, and avid collector of Ulysse Nardin's. Ulysse Nardin is a brand that I'd really like to see more from. What did they do? I can't even think of what they did this year, which is kind of sad, but I love what they've done with the Freak, for example. I think the Freak is such a unique take on a watch, and I actually had a friend of mine who was looking to get one. Unfortunately, he didn't end up going forward with it, but he asked me to do a little bit of research into it, and it's just so interesting the way that, for starters, it's technically a tourbillon, or it serves the same purpose as a tourbillon. It solves the same problems as a tourbillon, in the sense that your entire movement and your escapement is rotating around the course of the dial, because it's on that carousel. And then also, you look at some of the parts, especially the silicone ones, the machine ones, the amount of detail that must have gone in. Like, I'm a big Formula One fan, And when you look at a Formula One car, you see all these tiny little fins and little cuts and things. They're all designed to make the aerodynamics better. You can see a similar sort of approach in the escapement in the silicon escapements and silicon parts of a new Nissan Freak. They really, really do amazing things. And yeah, I mean, also materially, they've got stuff like, they've got different forms of forged carbon with different colors inside them. Obviously titanium, ceramics. So again, Ulysse is a brand that I think definitely needs a bit more attention, but that also should call a bit more attention. I mean, the Freak is cool, but they're not making enough noise about it. I mean, there are other lines, like their diver line, I think is really cool, but it's also quite big. The Marine diver. The full titanium one is, I think, 44 mm, which is a bit big for my taste. They do have the 42 mm version, but that one doesn't have the in-house movement, doesn't have an open case back. It's priced to compete a bit less. However, good example of, actually doing good modifications. While it does have a Salida movement on the inside, they do at least put the silicone escapement. And Ulysse Nardin, they actually have their own silicone making branch, essentially. And they've been pioneers in the silicone technology in movements. So I like that at least they put that in as a proper modification. That's a proper modification. That, or something like when Tecor initially did the isograph with the carbon nanotube hairspring in the Altavia 300. That, I think, was cool. I mean, it didn't end up working out for them, and they sort of unceremoniously withdrew it. But that approach, I think, is a good way to modifying, If they're going to make a modification that's meaningful and unique, then, yeah, of course, no problem with using an externally sourced movement, whether it be ETA or Salida. But, bringing it back to Panerai, if you're just going to put a sort of mediocre grade ETA 2894 and call it in-house, then, yeah, you're asking for trouble from a very, very scrutinizing audience. Alexander mentioning that UN also gives you the most affordable ground floor enamel watches among the big historic firms. Yeah, I mean, Ulysse Nardin, they play up in that echelon where, Patek and Audemars will, in terms of, doing the artisanship. When you look at some of their more expensive models, like offering fantastic value, of course, still pricey, but worth it. That artisanal working, or up there with, for example, with Blancpain as well. Blancpain is another brand that I think is criminally underrated and underappreciated, but that also suffers from a similar thing, that they don't really call enough attention or draw enough attention to themselves in order to stand out. So Blancpain is another brand where I think definitely we could see some cool stuff. I mean, for Only Watch, they did sort of it looked almost like a Halloween theme with the black and orange, but obviously orange was the theme for Only Watch. But they used, I think, one of the no-rad dials. That was cool, but, I think they do need to lean a little bit more, I think, into the bathyscaphe, which is a bit more modern. Play around a little bit with the sizing, maybe, because I think 43 alienates a few people, and then people might think the smaller version is just for women. Even though I think it's a 39, if I'm not mistaken, 39 or 40, the women's one. But it still has, a nice movement. It's nicely proportioned. I do think, though, that the dial to bezel ratio is a bit funky on that smaller one. So I think they should maybe look into that. I think that would be a great opportunity for Blancpain to maybe draw some more attention to itself. Or also they should re-release the Le Mans. I mean, when they discontinued it, it wasn't a particularly well-performing model for them. But if you look at some of those older Le Mans, like the Le Mans Flyback, the Perpetual Calendar Chronograph is an amazing looking watch. Like, open another tab and search for the Blancpain Perpetual Calendar Chronograph. It looks sick. Alexander is asking, is the Panerai Submersible 42 a good watch? I mean, admittedly, I would say I think it is a little bit pricey for what it is. For what I remember, it's close to 10,000. I don't remember, but I mean, like, on paper, it's nothing out of this world. 300 meter water resistant. It's got a ceramic bezel. But I think it looks cool. It uses one of the Valfleury movements on the inside, which is good. So these are the ones that are, as I was saying earlier in the live chat, they are still in-house-ish, or in-group, better said. But at least it's a more exclusive movement than, like, an ETA or something like that. I think overall it's a cool watch. I think it looks cool. Personally, I prefer the Marina. I like the look of the Luminor without the rotating bezel. It looks kind of like an afterthought, even though ironically, historically, the Submersible is probably more true in terms of purpose. Um, but if it was my money, I would save it and get a Luminor Marina, um, ideally on a bracelet, because Panerai bracelets are very cool and very, very sturdy as well. When I did the review a couple years back for the PM 161, that was with the steel and titanium bracelet, and that was sick. Like, it was built like a tank, felt super solid, but because it was mixed with steel and titanium, it wasn't that heavy, so it had that sort of cool mix. I mean, you can imagine that if it was full steel, it probably would have felt like it weighed a ton. That's how solid it felt. But yeah, if it was my money and I was looking for Panerai instead of a Submersible 42, I would go for a Luminor Marina 42. Or even 40, I think they do as well. So, yeah, just because I think the bezel, more than anything, looks like a bit of an afterthought, you have more choices with the Luminor as well, with the non-submersible Luminor. And I think those are still 100 meters water resistant. So, for day-to-day use, obviously, it's still perfectly fine. Luminor Marina, your third favorite Panerai. What are the first two? For me, definitely Luminor Marina is my favorite. That or as an overall collection, and then if we're talking specifics, the 161 with the GMT, and also the I forget the reference, but it was one of the early Luminor chronographs with the zenith alpha movement on the inside. That was a sick watch. I would really love to have one of those actually in my collection. That would probably be the Panerai I would get. If I could do everything all over again, and if I knew what I knew without necessarily having bought the Seamaster to start my collection, I probably would have started with the PM 161 because that's like a perfect all-rounder. It's not too big. It's steel and titanium, so it's got a bit of two-tone in there. You can pull it off kind of as a dress watch, with that Panerai Italian charm, I guess. And I had a GMT. Yeah, it was 750 base, but that's fine. Had good water resistance. That for me would be an ideal first watch if you're spending a lot on your first watch. Oh yeah, the Radomir, it looks cool, but on my wrist it just looks ridiculous. I don't know why. I've tried a couple Radomirs on, and it just really, it just doesn't gel with the look on my wrist. At some point when I get a chance to, I'll review one and show you guys on the channel. But yeah, I'm just not a big fan of how it looks on my wrist. And then, as I mentioned, the Submersible, in purpose it's cool, but for me the bezel just looks like a bit of an afterthought. I think the Luminor design looks much nicer without a rotating bezel. But yeah, and then now I think, did Panerai do anything interesting this year? Off the top of my head, no. I think they did the Eco Steel ones, which, interesting, but pricey. What I do think is cool that Panerai has done with regard to their movements is they've had a few of these ones where they're like 75-year warranty. That's standing by your product. But I don't understand how the same company that can do that is at the same time putting in an ETA 2894 in a watch and then claiming that it's in-house. Yeah, John Prosser describing the movements on Panerai is best described as industrial. True. Interestingly, I find that the finishing on their outsourced movements, specifically the rotors, is actually much nicer than on their in-house ones. On the in-house ones, it's very industrial, similar sort of vibe to like the finishing on Tudor in-house movements, for example. But if you look at their early 2000s-ish display case back outsourced movements, so the OP ones, on those they would have this really cool, it was almost like a hologram. Like maybe some people might think it's a bit cheesy, but it looked almost like a hologram sort of pattern in terms of how they would superimpose the OP logo on it. I think that was really cool. It was a cool way to individualize their movements, like for example when they did on the Zenith El Primero, equivalent that they did with the in the Panerai Luminor Chronograph. That just looked really cool. Ironically, with their more in-house ones, they're a little bit more industrial, a little bit more Spartan. One thing that is really cool, Mr. B, he recently did a video showing it was the Luminar base models, I think. It was the Luminar base, and then he also showed a Luminar GMT. And the Luminar GMT actually had the power reserve on the back. That very subtle touch, very discreet complication, but I think that's cool attention to detail. So again, it baffles me that on the one hand, Panerai can do it so right, have solid movements, even if they're in group, who cares? If they're in group, that's good enough. Solid movements in terms of technology, in terms of dimensions as well, because they're never particularly chunky movements. Good power reserves, little quirks like having the power reserve showing on the movement itself. They can do things so right in that sense. But then they can fail so wrong with this latest sort of debacle. And I think that's really the biggest thing. It's like they always say it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. I think this is a clear case of that. In my view, it wouldn't have been the end of the world if they'd have just said, yeah, this is an outsourced movement, call it OP, XXXB, II, B, C. I've run out of Roman numerals. Call it something like that, and then call it a day, and then continue to call their Valfleury manufactured movements, call those in-house, that's fine. For the most part, they're the only ones that use them, so I don't think that's the end of the world. And also, again, it's in group, so all of the big boys do it. Swatch does very, very similar sort of thing. They share a lot of their more upgraded ETAs amongst different group members. Blancpain shared its movements with other brands as well. The Piguet movements are now Blancpain movements, and those have been shared around a little bit. If you look at some of their chronographs, they're still using the Piguet base, albeit evolutions of it. They call that in-house, but there are other companies that have it as well. So it's not the end of the world in my view. Similar sort of thing with LVMH. The funny thing is, though, is that LVMH would share the El Primero, but even I think on the Spirit of Big Bang, on the actual website, they actually highlight that it's based on the El Primero. And they capitalize on, the history. They use that history to give them some credibility. And I think that's smart marketing. That's, smart communication to your customer. Hublot recognizing, yes, they have the Unico, which is a very cool movement. They've done a few high complications that were designed in-house. But at the end of the day, they know that, they still catch some flack for things like Classic Fusion using Solitas. Same thing with the Big Bang Classic. So with the Spirit of Big Bang, they put in the Zenith El Primero movement, and they capitalize on it. They say, this is based on the El Primero, because they know that gives them credibility. And the El Primero has been doing that for, decades. I mean, I did an entire video on how companies would use the El Primero as a way to sort of have some credibility when making a chronograph, especially if it was one of their first. Bulgari, another great example of that. Only till recently, they were actually using the El Primero still in their Velocissimo models for the octos. Not the Octo Finissimo chronograph, that's in-house, the chronograph GMT, but the regular size Octo Finissimo octo chronograph. So I think there's definitely ways that you can play around with in-group and use it to your advantage. Another great advantage, I think, is the Mont Blanc Time Walker. That one uses a movement from an IWC. Now, they call that one Time Walker manufacturer, which, again, a little bit disingenuous. But the net result is that it's actually getting a better movement than probably if they'd have made it themselves, unless you count Minerva. But Minerva is a whole other echelon of Mont Blanc watch, But if you think otherwise, if they'd have just made their own standardized in-house movement, it probably wouldn't have that much cachet. But they can say, oh, this has an IWC movement in it. It carries a little bit more weight. Ironically, IWC still has a lot of their in-house movements that are essentially clones of the 7750. Similar sort of thing happened with Cartier with the 1847, if I'm not mistaken, the one that's in the Pasha and... Is that in the Pasha? Yeah, I think that's in the Pasha. And the Santos. Those, if you look at them, they're also kind of... those are pretty much spec for spec, almost the same as the ETA 2892 that they replace, even in size. So in that sense, it's like, why even bothering with in-house if you're not going to do something new? At least the 1904 has the 2 barrels, so at least that's a technological advancement for it. John Prosser saying as well, they keep hiding behind materials. No one asked for them to justify the cost, such as E-steel, which is more expensive even though it's recycled. Yeah, I mean, I touched on that. Like, Panerai has made a little bit of a strength for themselves in terms of dabbling in new materials. You know, I think that that's fine. That's their gimmick. I just don't understand why they had to do this whole thing with the movements. You mean, no, it comes back to what I was saying earlier in the chat. I'm not sure if you were watching at that point, but earlier I was talking about how where people's expectations are. I think for the most part, people aren't buying a Panerai for the movement. So if people's expectations aren't there, then you don't have to lie about it. It's worse the fact that they lied about, the this new one, being in-house when it's just an ETA. That is worse than the fact that it's an ETA. Everyone says that, oh, it's a $27,000 watch. It's like, well, yeah, it's made out of solid gold, and it's a Panerai. Of course, it's that much. It's like with the Bell & Ross BR05. That's also, I think, in the 20s in terms of pricing, but it's because it's the gold one. But the problem comes down to when you get the steel one, and it's still costing, in the case of the Panerai, around 10,000 US, and it's got an outsourced movement that they're saying is in-house. I think even if they still just came straight up, designated it as an OP movement when that was outsourced, I think that wouldn't have caused a stir. You might have a few people complaining, oh, it's bad value for money or whatever, but people would still buy it. I think this has just brought them a lot of unnecessary negative publicity when the company itself already has a built-in solution for it in terms of that OP nomenclature they used to have for outsourced movements. So we keep coming back to Panerai, but I think, starting the topic and I think it's an interesting topic to see how different people have approached it. That A Blog to Watch article was very true for a lot of things, but also I think was a bit harsh on them for the whole in-group thing. But I think in-group is fair game, because that's one of the advantages of a group, is they can pool their resources together to have a shared movement manufacturer, but that's still within group, and that is still developing movements that have, better technical specs than, the typical ETA 2892, 2824, 7750, and their Salida equivalents. Because you got to think those designs have been around since the 80s, 70s in some cases, and they haven't moved the needle at all. So I would definitely prefer, especially if we're talking spending over 5,000. I would definitely prefer at least a more advanced movement that is at least in group versus them copping out and just using an outsourced movement, not doing anything to it. And even like I said earlier, Ulysse Nardin is a great example of, at least with with their Diver 42mm, yeah, it uses a Salida SW300, but it has Ulysse Nardin's proprietary silicon escapement. Or similar sort of thing with what Montblanc does with the 1858 Geosphere. Also a SW300, but it has their own proprietary module on top. And who else has seen, that sort of 2-hemisphere with a 24-hour indicator and GMT jumping on our hand? Who else is doing that? No one. I think that's really cool. That's a good use of workhorse movements, externally sourced movements, to use them as a platform. At the end of the day, no one's going to be impressed with what Cartier did with the 1847, where they just recreated an ETA 2892 in-house instead of using the one that they could have bought. It's like, that's not impressive. But if they're using something like an ETA as a base to put on a new technology, then I think that's really cool, and that's fair game, and that's something that I would pay for. Because then also you kind of get the best of both worlds, because maintenance on that base movement will be peanuts compared to a full in-house movement. Oh, thanks. John saying he loves my content. Thank you, much appreciated, and thank you for everyone who's been watching so far throughout the stream. I just did this randomly, purely because I hadn't had the time to put together a video for today. Hopefully next week we will be back to our normal, regular scheduled content. But I wanted to at least do something. It had been a while since I had done a live stream. So I wanted to do something, to at least sort of reach out to you guys and you know, it's always fun from time to time doing a live stream because I can read your comments and then just sort of not be stuck with the constriction of having a focused video or a video that I have to take 5 days to edit. Because, yeah, when I used to do those much longer videos that lasted like 20, 25 minutes, it took forever to edit. And then, yeah, I couldn't produce at scale or in quality. And I think that kind of reflected back then. But that being said, we are now coming up at 50 minutes, and it is getting kind of late over here. So I'm going to wrap things up. But thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, everyone, for commenting. And, yeah, let's see. Maybe I might do this a little bit more frequent, but probably with actual promotion, so that you guys know that it's actually coming up. But yeah, thank you everyone for watching, and let me know in the comments below if you're watching this after the live stream. Let me know what you guys think. What do you guys think of, you know, this whole Panerai debacle with the in-house movements? What do you think, you know, what would you really put your money towards in terms of in-house, modified, or off-the-shelf movements? And then also what you think of some of the new releases that have come out this year. I mean, we've still got 4 more months left, or 3.5 left of the year. I'd really, really be curious to see what comes out in Q4, especially because in the post-COVID era, it's like, you know, the gloves are off. Companies can release a new model whenever they want and just promote it online on social media, which I think is really cool. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the rest of this year looks like. But in any case, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for commenting, for watching. If you're watching this after, you know, drop a comment below. Love to hear your thoughts. And yeah, we'll catch you on the next one.